Hey guys, so we're going to be creating what I like to call the economics Bible. We're going to be basically creating a massive review packet. Today we are going to be creating a packet, and in that packet we are going to go over everything PPF curve, everything circular flow, and everything the microeconomic version of supply and demand. So we didn't cover the first time because honestly, probably not going to have a question about it on the AP exam, but you never know. It's popped up as one or two questions every once and again, but sometimes they'll have zero questions about this because technically it is a microeconomic topic. But it's always good to know the basics. So we're going to start off with the PPF curve. So I'm creating let me get a little bit better here. Creating like a new document I would handwrite this just to make sure, because you'll learn it better if it's handwritten, because it gets into your brain a little bit better. Let's start off with production possibilities curve. The production possibilities curve, what it illustrates, what it shows us, how much you can possibly produce with a given amount of resources that you have. It shows production levels, or possible production levels, with a given amount of resources. Just to quickly recap, let me change the size of this pen because my goodness. There. To quickly recap what these resources are, the resources are the factors of production, the FOPs. I can't write. I'm teaching to a class of nobody. That's why my mask is off. And I do better in front of a crowd. So FOPs, the factors of production, are the resources you need in order to produce, like land, like labor, capital. Remember, capital is like physical machinery, things like that. Entrepreneurship is the people that pay for it, like think of the investor. And human capital, your education, training, things like that. So with these given resources, how much you can possibly produce. And remember, there's like a typical like guns versus butter PPF curve that has military and domestic spending. But typically our go-to graph is going to be a curve between capital goods, which is going to be like your pizza ovens, and your consumer goods. Capital goods and consumer goods. And remember, different points and locations of where we are on this PPF curve shows us, how much production we have versus what is possible. The frontier shows us what is possible, but maybe we're producing less than what is possible, or maybe we're trying to produce more than what we possibly can do. So remember, a point inside the curve is possible, but since you're not using all of your resources, maybe you're not using all of your land or labor, maybe you have you're in a recession, you have all this labor that wants to work, that wants to have a job, but there's not enough jobs available, or you're just not using them. That's a recession. So you're just inefficient with your resources. Inefficient. This pen is like really thick. Let me use the, nope, okay. So, possible, but it's inefficient. It's wasteful. If you are on the PPF curve, whether you're on one extreme or you're some combo in between, you're using all your resources, and you can do that. You can use all your resources, and it's efficient if you use all your resources. You're not being wasteful with any of your land or capital. Of course, a point outside the possible curve is forget efficiency. It's just not possible. Of course, the PPF curve could shift because, this is our given amount of resources of what we can produce. But what if we have more resources? So remember, there are things that shift the PPF curve. And you could shift it to the right, where you can produce more of both. to the left where you produce less of both, or you could have something that produces more of one without it producing the other. So if you had something more technical, like you are producing, you know, corn and tomatoes, and you get more corn seed and you can now produce more corn, that doesn't necessarily affect your production of tomatoes. So corn shifts to the right, but tomatoes stays in the same spot. So it's a shift, but it almost looks more of like a rotation. So it is a rightward shift of corn, but your tomato production is still the same. That wasn't affected. But usually, that's a really specific example of more corn seed. But a shift of the PPF curve is just because by a change in resources, a change in FOPs, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, human capital, or maybe a change in technology, or a change of interest rates. Because a change of interest rates could affect how much like land you can buy with the loan that you're taking out. So, you know, demand does not change production. But if you have something that affects the supply, the production level, then that is going to affect our PPF curve in a positive direction, more production, or a leftward direction, which is less production. And this is what shifts the curve. Of course, not all PPF curves are going to have that curvy production line like we just have been drawing. It depends on the type of products and the opportunity cost. So there is a constant PPF curve and an increasing PPF curve. And the slopes of the PPF curve, what it shows you opportunity cost. And remember, just to recap, opportunity cost is one of two definitions. It's either the second best choice, but for this example, the best definition is what you give up to get something else. What is given up to get something else? So is it a constant opportunity cost where, you lose three, get one, lose three, get one, lose three, get one? Is it the same slope throughout? So it's the same opportunity cost? Or is it an increasing opportunity cost, meaning the more you make of one, the more and more you're going to have to give up of the other? Well, it depends what products you have on your graph. So if you have a constant PPF curve, these two products are very similar in the type of resources that it requires. So this is going to be like corn and tomatoes. They are both, agriculture items. They both need a certain amount of land. They're not completely different. So constant PPF curves are typically two goods that have similar FOPs. So think of like cupcakes and cake, or brownies and cookies, things like that. They're basically the same types of ingredients, just maybe slightly different. While increasing PPF curves, these resources are totally different. So different FOPs. Like, airplanes and bread. Completely different resources that go into production of those things. And so the more and more you make of bread, the more and more airplanes you're going to have to give up, because the switching from one resource to another, since it's not an easy switch, since they're different resources, you're going to lose a lot in the effort of the switching. That's why it's increasing. So slope shows opportunity cost. Point shows efficiency. And shift shows a change of resources. So typically, when are you going to be using these graphs? So when do you use the PPF? Well, we use it to show long-run economic growth. Remember, long-run economic growth can also be shown on the long-run aggregate supply curve. So we have price level, we have real GDP. The LRAS shifting to the right is the same thing as the PPF curve shifting to the right, but typically we illustrate it on a PPF curve rather on an aggregate supply and demand. But long-run economic growth is one thing we will use the PPF for, and the other one is when we talk about trade, when we talk about comparative and absolute advantage. Should we be making shoes or bolts of cloth, and who has an absolute advantage in shoes and who has a comparative advantage in input and output, all that good stuff. So comparative and absolute advantage. So those are the really big times when we will use PPF curves. If they talk about long-run economic growth, that might be in a multiple choice question where they say which of the following would contribute to long-run economic growth, or which of the following would not contribute. A lot of people think that this is an aggregate supply and demand question. It might be like a GDP type of question, but it's not. It is a PPF curve question. So it's asking you about resources. So things that contribute to long-run economic growth would be anything that shifts the PPF curve to the right. Lower interest rates, more land, more labor, cheaper education, more human capital, something like that, more technology. All of these things would increase the production, which is what long-run economic growth really is. It really doesn't have anything to do with GDP, maybe potential GDP, but not GDP in itself, because GDP could be like in a recession if your GDP is too low, and that's not economic growth. So when you have a higher potential GDP, or if you have more production, that is going to be long-run economic growth, and that's a PPF curve question. The next thing we're going to talk about is the circular flow model. We haven't talked about this in a while, from like first weeks of school. But the circular flow model, what it shows us, it shows how several things flow through the economy, how goods and services, how resources, and how money flow through the economy. It shows how money, goods and services, and resources, FOPs, flow through the economy. And remember, it actually looks like a circle with like arrows, excuse me, and there's different like markets. So typically you have a household. Doesn't necessarily have to be on the left, it could be on the right. I just typically draw it like this. And a business. Businesses always kind of look the same. There you go. And how they interact with each other. So one way that houses interact with businesses is households give businesses money in exchange for goods and services. This transaction for money, for goods and services, this transaction is called the product market. Because that's what households are buying. The product market. They're buying products, they're buying goods and services. So this is basically, think of this as like aggregate demand. The money being spent for goods and services are C, consumer spending. Of course, businesses can buy from other businesses, that's I, investment spending. The government can buy from businesses, that's G. And foreigners can buy from our businesses, like for net exports, XN. So that dollar sign technically is the expenditure approach of GDP for in the product market. But that's one way that we interact with businesses. Another way is in a capitalist economy like ourselves. It's households that own the resources. It's not the government that owns resources. You're going to find that in more communist, socialist types of nations. But in a capitalist economy, it's households that own the resources, and they sell them to businesses in the market. And so we sell them our land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Ooh. And they give us money. Typically, it's in the form of like a wage. But remember, there are two ways to measure GDP. It's all of our spending in the product market, but it's also about all of our incomes in the income market. So this right here, this market is called, it's the income approach, but the market is called the factor market or the resource market. I typically combine them so I remember them better. The factor resource market, because that's what's being exchanged. Factors of production, which are also called resources. So this transaction is the factor resource market. Before, it was households that were the buyers and businesses were the sellers. But in the factor resource market, this time households are the sellers, they're selling resources, and the firms are the buyers. So this dollar sign, very similar to the dollar sign that's up there in the product market. If that was CIGXN, this one's also going to be GDP as well, but it's the income approach. This is the one that we talked about a while ago. So if you sell land, you get rent. If you sell labor, you get a wage. You sell capital, you earn interest. And you sell entrepreneurship, you get a profit. So that was the other way to measure GDP, was adding up everyone's income. Wages plus rent plus interest payments plus profit. And that is the money made in the factor resource market. This outside circle is typically called the simple circular flow model. The complex circular flow model is when the government is added in the middle. This time, taxes are coming in. And basically, public services are coming out, like education, healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, the military, Social Security, these types of things. So public works and services go to households. And businesses get subsidies sometimes, or that's like government assistance. So that's the circular flow model. The money that we spend is the money that we make, and the money that businesses make is the money that pays us. It all kind of flows together, but sometimes money gets leaked out. That means it leaves the circular flow model, and sometimes money gets injected in, meaning it comes from an outside source. There are leakages, and there's also injections. So leakage is money leaving our simple circular flow model. So notice how I said simple circular flow model, which means a leakage could be taxes, because that's included in the complex version of the circular flow model. But if we just focus on the outside circle, just think of it, all the money that you make that you don't necessarily spend. You don't get to spend your taxes. The government does that for you. What about savings? Savings is also another leakage. And if you import things from a different country, so if you buy a car from a different country, you send money out of your circular flow model. So imports. Those are some, there are other leakages as well, but those are the big three. Of course, in a perfect world, these will be injected back in. So taxes get injected back in as those like public services. Imports get injected back in as exports. And savings, well, remember, we've been talking about savings for a while now. Savings, you put money in a bank, and then the bank loans it out. That's the loanable funds market. And who are they loaning it out to? Well, businesses are taking the majority of these loans to buy capital goods, to make consumer goods. And so savings gets injected back in because you typically save money in a bank, and the bank loans it out in the form of a business loan. So that is an injection from the bank. Where do they get it from? From your leakage. So this is how the circular flow model kind of balances out, where the money that gets leaked out eventually should, theoretically, get injected back in. And the last bit of what we're talking about today is a graph that probably isn't going to be on the AP exam, or at least it's not going to be on the macro AP exam, but you actually kind of know it pretty well. It's just a regular supply and demand graph. It's like the micro supply and demand. We've always done aggregate supply and demand, but if you're like an on-level eco, if you're going to have to take microeconomics in college, then you're going to need to be familiar, and you are, with the micro version of supply and demand, which what it shows us is supply and demand of a single object. And typically, loanable funds is a microeconomic supply and demand because it's just talking about the supply and demand of money in the bank available for loans. Or even the money market graph is like one particular supply and demand of just money. But here's what a typical microeconomic supply and demand: it's price and quantity. I mean, if you expand this and make it an aggregate, basically it just turns into price level, the price level of all things. And if you like multiply quantity into the quantity of all things, well, we have a name for that, and that's GDP, which is why we use different words for aggregate supply and demand, but they are similar. This is just a smaller scale. It's just a regular demand curve, not aggregate, because the word aggregate means total. And we're talking about one thing. And it's just a regular supply curve. So you probably know a couple things that shift the supply and demand of a single product, but there's a list. This is just regular demand shifters and regular supply shifters. We'll do the supply ones first because you guys are actually more familiar with this. This is what we talked about in class. This is NITP, number of sellers, input prices, technology. This is nothing new. So the things that shift aggregate supply are the same things that shift regular microeconomic supply. The number of sellers, that's going to affect supply. Input prices, which is the prices of resources. You know, if chocolate chips are cheaper, you can supply more chocolate chip cookies. Technology, and that's the technology in the production of it. Not just like, oh, there's a new phone out, but the technology in how we make those phones. Expectations. That's always a shifter. If you expect it to happen, it will. And productivity. More productive, more supply. The demand shifters are a little bit different than regular aggregate demand because this is just going to affect the demand of like water or the demand of like jelly beans or the demand of peanut butter. And so there's an acronym for it. A student of mine made it many, many years ago, and it's ECO. That's the acronym. ITSECO. ITSECO. And those are the shifters of regular demand. I is income. When your income changes, that changes how much you can demand. Rich people buy more things. Poor people buy less things. If your income changes, that's going to affect how much you buy. T is tastes. If something's popular, something is really cool right now, people are going to be buying more of it. If people don't lack a taste for it, they don't want it, then there's going to be less demand. S stands for substitutes. So these are two items that are substitute for each other. It's this or that, Coke or Pepsi. The price of one is going to affect the demand of a substitute. So if, let's say, Coke is too expensive, maybe people now demand more Pepsi because the substitute of it changed. So it's basically the price of substitutes are going to affect the demand. E, well, what did I say is always a shifter. Expectations. If you expect it to happen, it will. C is complements. These are complementary items that go together. Milk and cookies, mac and cheese, socks and shoes. If the price of one changes, it's going to affect your demand of another. So complements would be like, think about last time you were at the grocery store. If they had a sale on cheese, what do they typically have right next to the cheese? Crackers. Because they know that if there's a cheaper complementary good, you're typically only going to buy it because it's cheap, and then you're going to demand its complement because they go together. So PB and J. If there's a sale on the PB, you're going to buy more J. And then O, it's kind of a stretch. It's number of buyers. If there's more buyers in a market, there's going to be more demand. If there's less buyers, there's less demand. So these are the things that shift demand of a single item and supply of a single item. And I'm going to do one more kind of bit that goes along with this, and it's just the law of supply and the law of demand. And it just explains the slope of the curve. Just looking at the demand curve, if the price of an item goes up, the the quantity demanded, QD stands for quantity demand, the quantity demand of that item goes down. It's too expensive, you can't buy as many. Of course, if the price of an item goes down, it's cheaper, you're going to buy more. The quantity demanded goes up. It's the exact opposite for supply. If you're a supplier and the price of the item is more expensive, and you can now earn a profit, more of a profit, because the price of it, the thing that you're selling is more expensive, you're going to supply more. The quantity of supply is going to go up. That's why supply is upward sloping, because these two items are directly related. Price goes up, you'll supply more. But if there's no if there's no income to be made, no revenue, no profit to be made, because prices are so low, why work as hard? I'm not, and I will supply less. That is why regular supply is upward sloping, because of the law of supply. That's what this is, the law of supply. And demand is downward sloping, because these two are inverses of each other. One goes up, the other one goes down. And that's the law of demand. Okay, so that was just a preview, or not a preview, but a review of circular flow model, the PPF curve, and microeconomic version, supply and demand. We will be doing more tomorrow, but basically we're going to be reviewing this entire course very, very quickly and make a nice little review book so you can have it to study not only for the final, but for the AP exam in the spring. But good job, everybody.